So I come from a legal background, and for close to 15 years, I've been working as both an activist as well as a researcher. And in a way, I come from a tradition which is broadly defined or identified as a law and society scholarship. There's a long history of various forms of kind of legal research and legal thinking. And to a large extent, the mainstream or the dominant mode is what we call the black letter law tradition, or the formal tradition within law, right? Where the focus is very much on legal principles, which are known as doctrines, as they emerge from within the law. So there's an internal logic to it. The law and society tradition basically challenged this by looking at the law not merely as some kind of isolated, self-enclosed logic, but really one that circulates and moves through different kinds of worlds. And within that tradition itself, classically there has been a reliance in a way of an understanding of, let's say, the relationship between law, power, and society. So I think that what has happened in the last decade and a half is that this question of what is law and society has really opened out. And the various ways in which people understand what law is has itself kind of radically transformed. What do I mean by this? I mean very simply that law is not just understood in terms of prohibitions and rules, but really ways in which people understand it culturally. My own work actually began primarily with intellectual property. I was interested in how the entire transformation of the economy by the shift to the knowledge economy and what that meant from a public interest perspective, from the perspective not so much just about the protection of the rights of owners of intellectual property, but what it meant in terms of access to knowledge for a large number of people. From there, the larger work that I was also interested in was the question of the relationship between law, media, and technology. Part of that work has also kind of dovetailed into a larger kind of, let's say, a more formal understanding of freedom of speech and expression. And finally, from there, the third phase of a lot of the work that I was doing was really on the relationship between law and popular culture, especially in India, where cinema remains one of the most important kind of cultural forms. My question was, how does one look at cinema as an archive of law and justice? If one looks at the history of, for example, just Hindi popular cinema, you notice that it's replete with references to courts, to law, to police, etc. So how does one look at cinema as staging a conversation with justice? And finally, my current work that I'm currently doing is twofold. I'm looking at the history of the big trial in India and the court trial in a way as a theatre of justice that a large number of people participate in. And the other work that I'm looking at is on the relationship between the judiciary and media in terms of the emergence of what I'm describing as a new kind of judicial populism. So a lot of my current work is understanding the dynamics of these two. In the domain of intellectual property, it's not so much the physical aspect as much as the ownership of intangibles, right? Whether in the form of copyrights, patents, etc. And intellectual property has been seen primarily as one of the key drivers of creativity and innovation. And the classical argument is that without the creation of incentives in the form of intellectual property, there will be kind of in a way a decline in innovation and in creativity. My own work has not been so much on patent, it's been much more on copyright. And there are two dimensions that I've been interested in. One is the question of the relationship between copyright and culture, and the second is the question of access to knowledge. On copyright and culture, what is the world of copyright? So it's an area that is really, really ripe for interdisciplinary inquiry, because in a way, if one looks at the foundational pillars of copyright law, the idea of the author, the idea of originality, these have been narrated in a way as universals, but it's a lot more complicated. And in a way, I was inspired by a lot of the work that had been done in the early kind of 2000s, etc., that made the argument that copyright, as it expanded, tended to not promote creativity as much as deter it. Because for you to be able to participate in the world of kind of making of culture, there has to be a common pool that you draw from. This is very different from some romantic idea of originality that one creates something out of nothing. So that's one part of what we did in terms of my work on intellectual property. The second element of that was on the question of access to knowledge. And here, to use one sharp example of this, we were involved for a very long time on understanding the ecology of access to knowledge with a focus on books. So recently, a couple of years ago, a case was filed by the leading kind of, publishers, academic publishers in the world, including Oxford, Cambridge, etc., against a small photocopying shop in Delhi University. Now, this is a classical case of the way the battle lines have been drawn. The argument of the publishers is that free photocopying basically kind of ate up into their market and would destroy the future of academic publishing. At the same time, from the perspective of the students, without the infrastructure of photocopying, how would a large number of students access books which are prohibitively expensive? So we were looking at this from the perspective both of the law, to make an argument that fair use in India was very specific in terms of it differed from the American tradition because it allowed for the reproduction of works for educational purposes. Our argument was that students who are photocopying material are not the enemies of publishers, they're their greatest allies. So access makes readers, and readers make the market for books. By making it impossible for students to access learning materials, you actually end up destroying future markets as well as future creativity and scholarship. So a lot of my work has been to situate freedom of speech and expression and the battles around it within a wider historical context. One example, which is on the question of hate speech. If you look at the roots of this, a lot of this begins really in the context of the 20s, where there were certain kind of incidents that had happened. A very famous case called the Rangila Rasool affair, the original kind of Salman Rushdie case, if you like, in which two religious communities were in conflict with each other. What it did was it allowed at that point of time for the British to create this idea of the emotionally excitable native subject. And it did this in the way of the creation of this kind of, transcendental, neutral arbiter, which is the government or the British, to regulate, religious communities. So when you have a provision that incorporates and legislates an emotional category like hatred, it becomes the basis on which communities also then make claims to that emotional category, right? So a community now will have to show that their sentiment is hurt. And these become, over a period of time, legal categories. So it's this question of how does the emotive become the legal, and what does that mean in the long run for an understanding of the public sphere? It's not redundant to study law in a conventional way, but it's absolutely crucial to supplement it with the insights that other disciplines bring to your understanding. So at Ambedkar University and at the school that I'm a part of, which is the School of Law, Governance and Citizenship, we are engaging in a very innovative experiment. We are offering for the first time in the country an MA in law. It's an MA in law, politics and society, as opposed to an LLM. So we're not training people to become, kind of more sophisticated lawyers. We are instead inviting people from a range of disciplines, politics, anthropology, economics, history, sociology, to study the law. And we are arguing that legal studies is very different from studying to be a lawyer. That the law is way too important to be left to lawyers alone. And there's a need for people from a wide range of practice and from disciplines to collectively and creatively interrogate the law, because the law implicates all of us, and yet it's only a very small number of people who are actually allowed to speak about the law. So to democratize that and to open out the creative potential of what legal studies can be is basically what we are experimenting.